Good evening, everyone. On behalf of the Cathedral chapter, and welcome to tonight's conversation celebrating our architect Sir Giles Gilbert Scott and his legacy in terms of Liverpool's architectural landscape and heritage. This event is part of our centenary programme celebrating 100 years since the consecration of the first part of the main space as a place of worship. I'm delighted to introduce Dominic Wilkinson, architect and principal lecturer in architecture, art and design at Liverpool John Moores University, who's going to chair this event and will introduce the speakers.
Thank you, Canon Anderson, and welcome to everyone on bonfire night. Those of you who don't like fireworks are here. We will have three speakers this evening, and I would just like to give a little brief introduction to each of them. Our first speaker will be Joseph Sharples. He's an author and architectural historian, curator of the Mackintosh collections at the Hunterian Gallery in Glasgow, and he's probably best known as the author of the Pevsner Architectural Guide to Liverpool. Our second speaker is Mike Darwell. He is an architect. He is the Cathedral Architect, that is his official title, or Liverpool Cathedral Architect. He is an architect accredited in building conservation with a specialism in ecclesiastical architecture, and he's a member of the Liverpool Diocesan Advisory Panel advising on works to historic buildings and churches. And our third speaker is Dr. Ataa Alsalloum, who's an architect and senior lecturer at Liverpool University School of Architecture, a specialist in sustainable heritage, and a member of the Institute of Historic Building Conservation. Sorry, I couldn't read my own notes there. And is also chair of ICOMOS Education and Training Committee, ICOMOS being one of the arms of the United Nations. Each of our speakers will have about 15 to 20 minutes presentation, and at the end of that, we'll have a period for questions and answers. If you wish to raise any questions, please put them in the webinar chat, and I will be keeping an eye on that during the presentations and after the presentations, and I will be pulling questions out of that to ask our speakers. The anticipated end is about 8 o'clock this evening. Okay, without further ado, I'd like to move on and invite Joseph as our first speaker to take us through his presentation. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Dominic. All the speakers tonight have undertaken to begin their presentations just by saying a little bit about how we first came to know the cathedral and how it became part of our lives. And so in my case, I remember that occasion very distinctly. It was in the winter of 1981. And I was a student studying art history at the time. And I came to Liverpool for the first time ever to see the Walker Art Gallery. And I spent some time exploring the city, and I was absolutely amazed by the magnificence of its architecture and the contrast between that magnificence and the present state of decay and poverty that you saw at every turn in the city, because we're talking about the early 1980s when Liverpool was at the depths of its economic decline. And it was a cold, dark winter afternoon, and I eventually found my way up to the cathedral, which at that date, in the early 1980s, was surrounded by dereliction. There was just an area of rubble where there'd been Georgian houses in front of the cathedral, and you crossed that to reach this extraordinary building. And at that time, the entrance wasn't by the west door, as it is now. It was still by the Rankin porch in the middle of one of the long sides of the cathedral. And so I went up the steps into the Rankin porch, and it was almost completely dark inside the porch. And I literally felt my way around the curving passage and eventually emerged into the baptistry in the southwest transept, and was awestruck by the height of these vaults disappearing into shadow above me. And that is an impression that's never left me. And it made a profound impact on me on that first visit. And since then, of course, I got to know the cathedral a lot better in various circumstances. And several years later, I was lucky enough to come to live literally in the shadow of the cathedral. And I lived there for over 20 years and enjoyed the view of the tower every morning from my kitchen. So it became part of my daily life. But that first experience of seeing it as a student all those years ago has never left me. So I'm going to move on to talk now this evening about the architectural history of this building. And I'm just wondering if I can bring up my pictures. Don't seem to be appearing. I wonder if Emma can help me with this. Here we are. Oops. Here's the first one. Yes. So I think it's important to understand the history of the cathedral in terms of the history of Liverpool as an ecclesiastical centre. When we think of cathedrals in Britain, we tend to think of great medieval churches in places that were important in the Middle Ages. But of course, Liverpool was nothing more than a fishing village in the Middle Ages. It had no great church inherited from that period. And until the end of the 19th century, it came for religious administrative purposes under the Diocese of Chester. And yet it was a city vastly larger than Chester. And so there was pressure to create a new diocese centred on this enormous metropolitan city on the Mersey. And eventually that bore fruit in 1880, and the bishopric of Liverpool was established at that time. And immediately the idea of building a cathedral to serve this new diocese was conceived and pursued actively by local merchants and others. And an architectural competition was held in 1884-6 for a site adjacent to St. George's Hall. That's where it was envisaged the new cathedral would be built, right in the heart of the civic centre of Liverpool. And what I'm showing at the moment are two pictures of one of the entries in that competition by an architect called James Brooks. And I show it because it illustrates the extraordinary location that was intended for this building. Here you've got James Brooks' massive Gothic design inspired by French cathedrals like Chartres, literally cheek by jowl with St. George's Hall, which you can see to the left, just 50 yards away from that great neoclassical temple. James Brooks didn't win that competition. It was won by this architect, William Emerson, with this extraordinary design, a sort of hybrid Gothic Romanesque Renaissance design with a great dome over the crossing. But again, you can see how it was designed for this site immediately adjoining the great neoclassical buildings that make up Liverpool's civic centre. Again, St. George's Hall on the left, and on the right, the Picton Reading Room in William Brown Street. Well, money couldn't be raised for this project, and so it faded away, and nothing came of these extraordinary designs by William Emerson. And it wasn't until 1900, with the arrival of a new bishop, Francis Chavas, that the cathedral idea was revived. And at once a committee was formed and a second architectural competition was held to find an architect for the cathedral. This is the advertisement that appeared in the architectural press to publicise the competition and to invite architects to submit designs. What's so striking about it is that it specifies that the style of the cathedral is to be Gothic. And this was an extremely controversial decision by the committee responsible for the cathedral scheme. At this date, the very beginning of the new century, there was a strong feeling that Gothic belonged to the Victorian age that was passing, and that architects were keen to develop new styles suitable for a new century. There was a strong feeling also that classicism, the architecture derived from ancient Greece and Rome via Renaissance Italy, was a modern style appropriate for building in the 20th century. And these two parties, the classicists, the modernists, were in conflict with the Gothicists. And so there were exchanges of letters in the press to object to this idea that the cathedral for Liverpool should be Gothic. And so the Gothic requirement was withdrawn, but there was an unspoken belief on the part of competitors that Gothic would probably be favoured above other styles. One of the architects who submitted designs in that competition was Charles Riley, who would later to become famous as a teacher of architecture at Liverpool University. And he was a strong proponent of classicism. And so his submission for the competition was this very grand, centralised, domed classical design. It's worth explaining that the competition was in two stages. So in the first stage, architects were invited to submit portfolios of drawings. They needn't be designs for cathedrals. They could just be examples of their work. But many architects did submit designs for cathedrals, including Charles Riley here. At the date of the competition, also, the site of the cathedral hadn't been absolutely finalised. There were two sites under consideration, one in Monument Place at the top of London Road, and the other, which was finally selected, St James's Mount, a fantastic site which allows the cathedral to dominate the city's skyline, and which also has a dramatic quality that comes from its being adjacent to a former quarry that later became a cemetery, which causes the ground to plunge away to a great depth on one side of the site and adds drama to the cathedral. The competition of 1901 was one of the great architectural opportunities of the age, and it attracted well over 100 entries, including entries from major talents. And so there was an extraordinary styleless design to be executed in concrete by the architect William Letherby and some associates of his. There was a Byzantine design by the architect Beresford Pite. And there were these designs, which in my present job I'm interested in particularly, by Charles Rennie Mackintosh, the great Glasgow architect of the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th centuries, in a sort of sinuous Glasgow Art Nouveau style. But none of these was successful. So the competition was won by this architect, Giles Gilbert Scott, and on the left is a perspective of the design with which he won the competition. He was one of the shortlisted architects from the first round, and then the shortlisted architects were invited to make designs for the cathedral, and Scott was adjudged the winner. I think two things strike you about this slide. The first is that the cathedral shown on the left looks nothing like the building that was built, which comes as a surprise. And the other thing that strikes you is the extraordinary youth of Giles Gilbert Scott. I don't think this photograph dates from exactly when he won the competition, but not long after. And he was only 22. So it was extraordinary for him to be given this remarkable opportunity at such an early age and with so little experience. In fact, he had no experience of building at all. Another difficulty was that, as well as being young and inexperienced, he was also a Roman Catholic. And in Liverpool, which was a very Protestant diocese, that was perceived as a disadvantage. And so the decision was taken to appoint as co-architect, alongside Giles Gilbert Scott, one of the two assessors for the competition, George Frederick Bodley. Now, Bodley was a very elderly man by this date. He was in his mid-70s, and he was one of the great figures of the Gothic revival in England, whose career was now drawing to its end. And you can imagine that the collaboration between these two men, the old, revered, distinguished Bodley, and the young, inexperienced, full of ideas, Scott, was fraught with tension. Scott almost immediately made revisions to the design that had won the competition. And this is the revised design of 1904, represented both in a dramatic perspective drawing and in a model which is still in the cathedral today and well worth looking at. And it shows the key features of the design, which survived from the competition winning entry, which were these two towers over the transept. And subsidiary transepts that were at the same width as the nave and aisles, didn't project beyond the aisles. 3 of these subsidiary transepts to the nave, 1 to the choir. And you can see these perhaps more clearly in the plan in the bottom right corner, the 2 great towers over the transept. You can also see in the plan that it was very much a traditional medieval longitudinal building with a long nave, almost twice as long as the choir, to the east of the crossing. And this was the design on which construction began in 1904. Just before I move on, I'll also point out the setting of the cathedral as shown in the perspective on the left, with the drama provided by that cemetery former quarry that I mentioned earlier, this great chasm that opens below the cathedral on its liturgical north side, and Scott makes a feature of it in this perspective. Well, the earliest parts of the cathedral to be built were the Lady Chapel and the East End, which are shown in these 2 pictures. And they're very different in character from the later phases of the cathedral, much more intricate, elaborate, with more sculptural decoration, more complex tracery in the windows, more numerous offsets to the buttresses that divide up the exterior of the Lady Chapel. And it's been speculated that these features might be due to Bodley's input as co-architect, but that's not at all clear from the documentary evidence. There were certainly struggles, tensions between Bodley and Scott, but it's not clear that Bodley dominated the design to the extent of determining these features. Inside the Lady Chapel, on the left here, you see the same decorative elaboration as we saw on the outside. But also very clearly what you see in this interior is the structural system that underlies the Lady Chapel, but also the whole of the cathedral, which is the use of internal buttresses, piers, short walls of solid stone at right angles to the interior walls of the cathedral, from which the vault springs and which at ground level are pierced by small archways that form passage aisles through those piers on either side. It's not clear from the photograph on the left here, but it is clear from the photograph of the choir on the right, which uses the same system, how these internal buttresses work to hide the windows in the side walls of the church when you look along its length. And so you, unlike in many medieval churches where the interior is dominated by columns and arcades, arches springing from the columns and large areas of stained glass, in Liverpool Cathedral, what you're most aware of is solid wall and solid stone vaults, and the windows from many viewpoints are hidden. Their light filters through between the piers, but the windows themselves are hidden, and the emphasis throughout is on areas of solid masonry. Well, as I say, the collaboration between Bodley and Scott was fraught with difficulty. It came to an end, however, when in 1907, Scott died at the age of, Bodley died at the age of 80. And so Scott found himself on his own to control the cathedral unhindered by Bodley's interference. And then something absolutely extraordinary happened, which is that in 1910, Scott decided to completely alter the design of the cathedral. In fact, hardly anything of the original design remained. And, you know, he was still in his 20s at this time. And it's absolutely extraordinary that he took this decision so soon after winning the competition. And even more extraordinary that the committee responsible for building it accepted his proposal. They seem to have had the necessary confidence in him to do that. These 2 plans show the essential characteristics of the changes that Scott brought about. So the plan at the top is the revised plan of 1904, very close to the competition-winning design, to which construction had adhered until this point. The plan at the bottom shows essentially how the cathedral was completed. It's not exactly the plan that was devised in 1910, but it's very close to it and developed from it. And you can see from this revised plan of 1910 that what drove Scott's revisions was his desire to have, instead of the two towers over the transepts that had dominated the original design, a single central tower, much bigger and much higher, right in the centre of the composition that would dominate the cathedral externally. Now, such a tower was too big, too wide, had too large a footprint to fit over the crossing that formed part of Scott's original plan. And so he decided to locate it further west of the transept, which had been the site of the two towers. And the tower was to be the width of both the choir and the choir aisles together. So it was much wider than the width of the choir or the nave. And because Scott wanted a symmetrical composition, he decided then to duplicate the transept, which had originally been the site of the two towers, to duplicate that west of the new central tower. So you get this extraordinary composition in the middle of the revised design, this massive central tower with two transepts to either side of it, and then a much reduced nave to the west of that central composition, a nave exactly the same length as the choir. So you now have an absolutely symmetrical composition, central tower flanked by two transepts, flanked in turn by nave and choir. And the cathedral is symmetrical about both axes, the long axis and the short axis. And the main achievement internally of this this revision is the creation of a vast central space under the tower and spreading into the transepts, which is something that the original competition terms had asked for, and Scott's winning design had failed to provide. But now in the revised plan, he provided that great central space within sight of the altar, unobscured by columns or screens or anything else. Try to move on my slides. Here we are. This is a perspective showing the 1910 revisions from outside, and you can see very clearly from this external view the symmetry that Scott had achieved by introducing the central tower flanked by the transepts, flanked by the nave and choir of equal length. What you also see here is that the tower, as redesigned in 1910, was very different from the tower that eventually was built and completed during the Second World War. And Scott was constantly revising the tower design, the general tendency being to make it taller, more tapered, more graceful, but always retaining this transition from a square base to an octagonal upper section. And it's true actually of the whole cathedral, that although the design was revised in 1910, Scott continued to alter it, to develop it constantly. The art critic of the Liverpool Echo said at one point of Scott that he never saw a full stop without thinking it could be turned into a comma. In other words, he was constantly thinking that the design could be changed. It had never reached its final stage. It was always capable of improvement or development. And this is the interior of that great central space, which was the main driver for the revisions of 1910, this vast uninterrupted space. And you can see very clearly in this photograph the relative width of the under tower space and the choir and its aisles. The under tower space is the full width of both the choir and its flanking aisles. This space opens out into this great space under the tower. And you can also see from this photograph how the vaulting over the first transept there between the under tower space and the choir had to be carefully adjusted to accommodate this change of width, which hadn't been contemplated when the first parts of the cathedral were built. A lot of the work that was carried out in the first phase of construction was predicated on the idea of those two great towers. And now a lot of that masonry was redundant, and other aspects of the design had to be modified to accommodate the changed plan. This north view of the cathedral shows the symmetry of Scott's revised plan very clearly. But also, if you look closely at it, it shows the evolving design from east to west, again, an illustration of how Scott never saw a full stop, but only a comma. So if you look closely at the design of the windows, it evolves from east to west, becoming progressively simpler. The sculptural decoration, the same. The buttresses in the eastern limb of the church are decorated with sculpture, but not in the west. But the overall character of Scott's approach to Gothic architecture is very clear from this view, that it's a modern Gothic, it's a simplified Gothic. It uses the elements of medieval architecture, but it combines them in new, unmedieval ways, always with this emphasis on huge, uninterrupted areas of masonry and concentrated ornament high up in the upper reaches of the design. Scott also believed in, as it were, tempering the vertical emphasis of medieval Gothic with a more, as he would have put it, reposeful horizontal element. And it's something you see in the Bankside Power Station, one of Scott's famous modernist buildings in London, in much the same way as you see here in Liverpool Cathedral, the contrast between the verticality of the tower and the horizontal emphasis of nave and choir to either side of it. Unlike medieval cathedrals, with their multi-phase construction often extending over centuries, the cathedral is remarkably harmonious and consistent in design throughout. And that's largely because Scott, who didn't die until 1960, was present throughout to control the design, and not just the architecture of the building, but its ornament and its furnishings. He exercised a strict control over everything that went into the building for as long as he lived. And the result is an extraordinarily harmonious interior. And this is particularly true of the sculptural decoration. And these are some of the figures carved by Edward Carter Preston, a Liverpool sculptor, whose work exactly suited Scott's vision for the cathedral, this simplified, Gothic-inspired but modern approach to figure sculpture, derived from French cathedrals like Chartres, but unmistakably of the mid-20th century. And the same is true of monuments and memorials designed for the cathedral, which in medieval cathedrals come in all shapes and sizes and styles, but under Scott's guiding hand were all consistent in the case of Liverpool Cathedral, and many of them, like the figures on the left, carved by Edward Carter Preston. I think that although Scott's redesign of 1910 resulted in a building which is overwhelmingly impressive, there are aspects of the design which, from a practical and functional point of view, are open to question. And I would single out particularly the treatment of the porches. Because of Scott's commitment to absolute symmetry in the design, you have the Welsford porch shown in this photograph, exactly mirroring the Rankin porch on the other side of the cathedral. Now, the Rankin porch faces onto St. James's Road and served as the main entrance to the cathedral. The Welsford porch opens onto the edge of the precipice that falls into the former quarry, now cemetery, on the other side of the cathedral. So it's functionally useless. It doesn't provide a ceremonial approach to the cathedral, but because of this commitment to symmetry, this vast construction had to echo, or rather mirror, the corresponding porch on the other side. Another practical problem with the building that I would argue is a result of Scott's ideological commitment to symmetry, is that it isn't clear always whether this is a longitudinal building or a building that you enter in the middle. And these great porches, especially the Rankin porch, suggests that that's the main entrance and that you come into the center, that you come into the under tower space, the central space of the cathedral. But actually now we enter it from the west end, exactly like a medieval cathedral. And so there's an uncertainty about which is the entrance front of the cathedral. and which is the side. But I think those practical considerations are really not what Scott was primarily interested in. I think the real function of the building was not practical but emotional. I think what Scott was aiming to do through this design, through these dizzying heights, was to create an overwhelming sense of awe and amazement on the part of visitors and worshippers, to remove them as far as possible from everyday reality and mundane considerations. There's a wonderful quotation from the architect and architectural critic Goodhart Rendell, who described the cathedral as a great engine of emotion. And I think that hits the nail on the head. The purpose of the design is to generate emotion in anyone who enters the building. Or like that, I think, would have been the feeling aroused by Scott's design for the west end of the cathedral, which he finalised in 1942, and which you see in the drawing on the left here, these great windowless cliffs of stone, building up to a climax of towers and lanterns and turrets. And then in front of those, this porte cochere extending right to the very edge of the cemetery and growing out of the living rock of the cemetery. It's an extraordinarily dramatic and imposing concept. Sadly, though, it was not to be, because of the astronomical rise in building costs in the post-war years meant that this was unaffordable. And so the facade of the west elevation that we see today and that you see in the photograph on the right was built instead. The photograph on the right also illustrates the dereliction that surrounded the cathedral by the time it was finally completed. It had been begun at the height of the city's prosperity. It was completed at the period of its deepest economic decline. I'm just going to end with a couple of images to talk about that setting and perhaps raise some questions that might come up later in the evening. While it was still under construction, the setting of the cathedral was threatened by the inner urban motorway, which blighted so much of central Liverpool in the 1960s and 70s. And you can see from these drawings how the motorway would have cut right in front of the cathedral on its south side and then swept round into Upper Parliament Street on its east side. The drawing says colossal scale dominates sight, but it's difficult to imagine that this road, had it been built, would not have undermined the dominance of the cathedral. Well, fortunately, that threat was averted or never realised. But I'd just like to end with this picture, which shows what I think is an important point regarding the cathedral today, which is that the threat now to the cathedral setting is more general, more widespread, not confined to its immediate vicinity, but to the wider city, because of the indiscriminate construction of tall buildings throughout the city. There's a fear that this once dominant building, this symbolically dominant building on the city skyline, will begin to lose that symbolic role that it's had since Scott conceived it back in 1901. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Joseph. Thank you for that talk. What we'll do is we will take the questions and answers for the speakers at the end. So we'll keep the pace moving by going on to our next speaker now. I'd like to introduce Mark Darwell, who's an architect accredited in building conservation and is Liverpool Cathedral architect and has been since 2019. So if I can hand over to you, Mike.
Yep, thank you, Dominic. Good evening, everybody. I hope to have control. But not quite yet. Okay, I will attempt then to preempt my first slide. Hopefully that comes across. To say that, yes, I am Mike Darwell. Yeah, here we go. I'm the current cathedral architect at Liverpool. The correct title is Liverpool Cathedral Architect. Some cathedrals have a surveyor to the fabric, but at Liverpool it is known as Liverpool Cathedral Architect. I was appointed by chapter in 2018 and I took a post in 2019. So this is now my second term in the position, with the position being renewed every 5 years, every quinquennium. We've done a bit of archive research, myself and the cathedral archivist, and we think I'm the 8th cathedral architect in succession following Scott, albeit the 3rd appointed under statute, which I shall explain a little bit more about. Despite being cathedral architect, I also have a day job. I'm director of John Coward Architects. We're a small practice based up in Cartmel and Cumbria, and I'm sat in my office now, having kicked everybody out for the evening. I'm an architect accredited in building conservation, AABC. I'm also a specialist conservation architect on the RIBA Conservation Register. As Dominic said, I'm a member of the Liverpool Diocesan Advisory Committee, as well as Blackburn Diocesan Advisory Committee, which sees me advise churches across the northwest of England, as well as working on upwards of around about 100 not 100 cathedrals, 100 churches of my own, where I'm appointed as the church architect. So my next slide, hopefully. Okay. So yeah, I thought I'd explain a little bit what a cathedral architect actually is in the current sense. So it's a statutory appointment. So it's a legal requirement. It isn't just a nice to have. Each of the 42 cathedrals in England has to have a cathedral architect, and we're all appointed under the Cora Cathedrals Measure 2011. The appointment is made by chapter. And if you read the measure, the primary aim of the cathedral architect is to produce a report every 5 years. We all call that the quinquennial inspection, and that report identifies the work that may be required to maintain the fabric of the cathedral. Allied with the report, the quinquennial report, we also provide an annual report to chapter of all work of repair, maintenance, and interventions that are carried out each year as identified in the quinquennial or otherwise. So the cathedral architect role is primarily an inspection role, but things do flow from that, as you can imagine. I take an active, often the lead role in all works or projects that would result in change or intervention to the cathedral fabric. And that change could be actual change, such as a repair, or it could just be a visual change, something that is being introduced into the cathedrals, such as a piece of furniture, or a recent example being a refurbished organ instrument. So projects can range from minor repair work to the building fabric, masonry, walls, floors, copper roofs, to major projects of intervention where we are looking to maintain the fabric, but equally improve access, building services, and structural works. The quinquennial report itself identifies work in a priority order, flowing from A through to E, so urgent work being A, and work which can be moved to beyond the quinquennium, but we very much need to keep it on the radar at E. And what we've done at Liverpool through the quinquennium, which I'll explain a little bit more about, is to group repair work by location. We could easily get lost in the vastness of the building if we're just looking at every urgent repair work and losing sight of some of the lesser priority items, the idea being that we would address those as and when access is available. So also flowing from the quinquennial inspection is a 5 or 10 year maintenance plan of cyclical repair work, because we do still need to clean the gutters, remove bird guano, etc., etc. So some of the images on the right there, that's me on the roof of it's me taking a photograph on the roof of the chancel with the cathedral clerk of works, some members in the maintenance team, and the cathedral structural engineer. One of the projects I've been involved with recently is the Josephine Butler Memorial Chapel in the centre. And as Joseph was explaining before about the Great Central Space, that is the Scott Memorial that was repaired in 2021 with previously sort of inappropriate resin repair work, badly matched stones. That was repaired and replaced. So involved in all of those projects as they go along. Hopefully skipping the next slide. Thank you. So I thought I'd mention a little bit about relationships because this is an important part of the cathedral architect's role. We're not there on sort of hugely high pedestal. I am very much part of a team, and it's a big team at the cathedral. And it's a team that works extremely well together. So as I said earlier, the cathedral architect is appointed by chapter. We provide the annual report. But flowing from that, I also advise or report rather to the Cathedral's Fabric Advisory Committee, or the FAC as we call them. And that report comes every quarter, and we make the Fabric Advisory Committee aware of everything that is needed by way of repair of fabric or any change that is coming on the horizon. So that takes form of individual project papers, including things like statements of needs, statements of significance, drawings, specifications, as well as information from the multitude of other consultants that are involved in even the smallest of projects. The FAC, as I've said, meet quarterly, and sometimes, more often with major projects, the Josephine Butler Chapel, as I just showed you on the previous slide being one, the project paper could be called in by the Cathedral Fabric Commission for England, so the CFCE. So the CFCE are party to all of the FAC minutes, so they are very aware of things that are being considered and can call projects in. So what that means is unlike in secular buildings where you have, for instance, listed building consent, which would be an application to a local authority if you wanted to make change. In the ecclesiastical world, even though buildings are listed, the cathedral listed grade 1, the approving body are the FAC and the CFCE, notwithstanding the need for planning permission if there is any external visual change that would be classed as development. As I mentioned before, at Liverpool, we have a very good working maintenance team, of which I'm part, and we meet monthly, so a monthly review of projects that are needed. And again, just on the right, just to run through those illustrations, things like the pendant light fittings in the chapter house, Scott original fittings that for a long time had an inappropriate LED, didn't really work. We needed to improve lighting there, so we had a project to refurbish and relamp those fittings, which required rewiring, which required work to mortar joints, wall paneling, and so on. In the centre, one of the flutes of the organ case of the organ in the Lady Chapel was dislodged. We had to fix that. That required a heck of a lot of scaffold, would you believe, to get to. So the photo bottom right is a buddleia sprouting from a mortar joint above the Welsford porch entrance. And again, it's still quite high up, even though it's just above the porch door. So that was roped access to get to that, which brings me on to how do we set about this process of inspection? And hopefully my next slide comes. Yeah. So access. We're Liverpool, with the 5th largest cathedral in the world, depending on the metric that you judge it by. So access, it's always going to be an issue. There are 4 examples there of access on the left, 110-meter boom, I think, to remove bird guano from the west front. Centre left, a access cradle by a specialist high-level team that is anchored in with shot blasted rivets into the concrete, and the guys swing off the edge of the staircase in the belfry and then hoist up that cradle all the way to the top. And that is to carry out 2 things. One was to remove dangerous concrete that was falling off and potentially damaging the bells, which are 42 meters-ish below that, as well as a full tactile survey of the ceiling soffit. Centre right, a traditional scaffold. This was in 2021 to repair probably about £4,000 worth of damage to one of the choir aisle windows on the north side. The scaffold, I think by the time we'd included the access to the exterior as well, was pushing £30,000. So huge issues of access, and how do we overcome these traditional roped access on the right? So at Liverpool, we're lucky. I banged the drum of digital inspection from around about early 2020, well, late 2019, I would say, digital inspection. So the cathedral committees ran with me with that, and hopefully this video plays. That was a fly on the wall of windowsill on the Lady Chapel. And we now have this. So we have a full high resolution digital twin of the cathedral. This is a video playing of just of a pan around of it, but this enabled me to sit pretty much where I am now and carry out a very detailed, albeit visual, inspection of all of the masonry, all of the copper roofs, all of the windows. So it took the cathedral architect to a point where, unless you're willing to spend a lot of time on a rope, it took me to a point where I could really understand what was going on with the building fabric. So this is a laser scan to create a building topography, and then it's overlaid with somewhere upwards of 100,000 high resolution SLR photographs captured via drone. When the peregrines allowed us to fly the drone, that is, because that wasn't straightforward. But we managed to do it. So I'm going back. I know digital twins are much more common these days, but I'm going back to early 2020 here. So it still is nearly 5 years ago, and it was just absolutely vital to understanding what was going on with the fabric of the cathedral. So that we could start to get some fact-based discussions about what bits we needed to fix. So, I mean, that super high resolution of the high parts. You can see here top of one of the belfry louvered openings where we've got a piece of loose stone that's just sat there. So that was a good example of where I could send the roped access team straight to that point, making efficiency of access and bringing costs down. So that, if that puts me to my next slide, which I hope it does, without it playing again. So that then resulted in a set of rectified photos, ortho photos as we call them, and that's the cover of the 2020 quinquennial. But that then allowed me to sort of generate heat maps, as I term them, of the external fabric. So without going into too much detail on this, the red bits are the bits that are very broken. The magenta bits are sort of less broken, but if you're going to go and fix the red bits, you would fix the magenta bit, and the purple hatches where repointing is needed. So in all, it wasn't the cathedral fabric, and if we take the tower as an example here, isn't in very bad condition. It's not that old after all. It has been weathered. It's suffering a lot from settlement. It's a new building, and it's a big building. There's a lot of load going down onto the ground. But what these could do is create that fact-based conversation about where defects existed, but also enabled us to very quickly communicate across every audience as to how we could set about and where we needed to set about repair work. So this is a close-up of one of the external crossings below the rose window on the north side, I think that is. We can see here, this is one of the bits where we're going to have to go and fix quite quickly, because we've got dipped masonry, relatively wide open joints. We're worried about destabilization of windows, things like that. So we can target that point where we would now go and put a fixed scaffold to that to actually carry out that repair work. That's the west front, as is now. Later construction, north facing, compass north facing. So it's the sheltered side. and then that reflects in the work needed. Less work, a little bit of cracking again from settlement that would happen, but generally we're more comfortable. And then we have the boring part, the data. This is the extract straight from the quinquennial. So again, this is a filterable Excel spreadsheet, which says what it is, the location of the defect, what element it is, its orientation, short narrative, and then a cost. And at Liverpool, it's always got a lot of noughts on. We have a bit of a joke at the maintenance team that everything costs £200,000, regardless of what it is. It's not quite true, but things are expensive at Liverpool. What I thought I'd then end on is to take a project that sort of brings all of that together. So this is the well floor. One of the first things I was involved in when I started January 2019, first day on the job, rocked up, and we were looking at drilling a hole in the floor to understand the construction. So it was quite, alarming stuff for me. But we rolled out this project. So that's the well viewed from the nave bridge, bay 3 up towards the west doors, bay 2 closer in frame. You can see already the difference in the tile pattern and the difference in the tiles even from that shot. So 2 different phases of construction, the 2 separated across where the piers are there by the temporary wall as construction progressed through the 60s, 70s. And the issue we had here was that the underfloor heating, which was copper pipe, set into concrete, had corroded as a result of being set into concrete, the reaction between the two. The heating throughout the cathedral is a hypercore system, so it's blown hot air generally, apart from some radiators down at the Lady Chapel, but generally blown hot air. In the well, the architect at the time had embraced more modern technology, and it was a wet system. So we've taken that. We had to take that step further. It was leaking. Water was actively coming out of the pipes, risking concrete, risking limestone. So the decision was taken to lift the entire floor and replace it. What we're able to use was a digital orthophoto of the well floor. So this is a laser scan. This is drawing generated from a laser scan on it. So we've got tile by tile basis. We've got joint widths accurately measured. I know it doesn't come across that well, but if I was to zoom in, then we would see that we've got this grid, labeled every tile, B27, F32. So every tile, and we knew we were going to lift all 642 of them, was going to be labeled and hopefully salvaged for relay. In the end, we lost 35, I think, through natural defect is what I'm blaming it on. So the work, we kept the cathedral open during this piece of work. So the diamond cutting was carried out at night, specialist team, that cutting to open up the very tight joint in the tile, underneath a full enclosure, dust extraction. We've got one, if not the most important organ instrument in the world in the cathedral. We obviously worked very closely with the organ team to make sure they were happy with what we were doing there, and they were happy that we were controlling the dust enough. So the tiles were cut, they were lifted. You can see top right, they were labelled. Bottom right, they were moved outside to the west front for an onward journey to the stonemason's yard. And then the underfloor pipework matrix was laid, which is plastic pipework, very modern construction, plastic pipework, flow screed, insulating flow screed. And then when ready, the tiles brought in. Bottom left is the contractor and the chair of the FAC discussing the project as we go forward. Bottom right is the project completed with the tiles all back, all reinstated. The cathedral didn't close. And now the west well floor is future-proofed to be run off a air source heat pump if we can get that project off the ground, which is a project we're actively working on as we speak. So that is me. I hope that's given you an introduction into the role of the cathedral architect and how we carry that role out at Liverpool.
Thank you. Thanks, Mike. And we're now going to move on to our third speaker, Dr. Ataa Alsalloum, who will bring to the fore more of the social and other aspects of the heritage value of the cathedral, I think, in her talk. So, Ataa, over to you.
So, thank you, Dominic. Hello, everyone. I'm honored to be part of this panel discussing a building that holds deep meaning for Liverpool and for me personally. Thank you, Joseph and Mike, for your insights on the cathedral's history, Scott legacy, day-to-day preservation, and the role of technology in safeguarding this magnificent building. So, building on these themes, I will focus on the cathedral's essential role in Liverpool's social, cultural, and spiritual life, impacting the community and countless visitors alike. Let me start by my own journey with this remarkable space. So, when I arrived to Liverpool from Syria, in 2007 to begin my PhD at the Liverpool School of Architecture, I had seen photos of the Anglican Cathedral, but nothing prepared me for experiencing its majesty in person. Visiting with my 4-year-old daughter, I felt an overwhelming sense of reverence and warmth. The stained glass light and also the welcoming atmosphere made it feel very, very special. When my late mother visited in 2008, it was a profoundly spiritual moment for us. Also, sharing lunch inside the cathedral with family and friends is a unique experience, rarely found elsewhere. In this photo, if I can get control, I am with my father continuing that tradition. Our tradition of attending Christmas Mass with family as well and friends has only deepened these connections, making the cathedral not just a landmark, but a cherished part of our life. I will move now to the professional bond. Since rejoining the Liverpool School of Architecture as a staff member in 2016, my connection with the cathedral has deepened. I've had the privilege of collaborating with various members of the cathedral team, especially Mike, the cathedral's architect, who supported our heritage-led design studio for third-year students. Mike's involvement has been invaluable, guiding students to connect with the cathedral, not only through its architectural beauty, but also through its cultural significance. I'm not sure what's going on with mine. So you can see here some examples of student work where they explored concepts for a new entrance and a potential commercial space for the cathedral. Later also we had the honor of exhibiting their project inside the cathedral. The students were very proud and visitors admired their creativity in such an iconic setting. So this experience underscored the cathedral's dual role. First, it preserves history, and second, it inspires the future through education and design. In addition, I lead a master program in sustainable heritage management, which has full recognition from the Institute of Historic Building Conservation. And we are planning placement with the cathedral offering students hands-on opportunities to collaborate on meaningful heritage projects. Now, moving from my personal journey to the cathedral's broader impact. I would like to highlight its role as a living tradition within Liverpool's community life. Before diving in, let's consider a significant milestone. So in June this year, the UK ratified the UNESCO's 2003 Convention for the Safeguarding of Intangible Cultural Heritage. This convention broadens our understanding of heritage, recognizing it as more than just monumental structures. It highlights living heritage, the rituals, traditions, performing arts, craftsmanship, and collective memories that sustain communities across generations. I believe that Liverpool Cathedral embodies this concept beautifully. It's not just an architectural marvel, it's a place where intangible cultural heritage thrives. Through its spiritual significance, community gathering, and the countless stories embedded in its walls. Scott's design for the cathedral blends traditional Gothic greatness with modern adaptability. By creating a flexible space, he ensured the cathedral could host diverse events while preserving its historic integrity, a vision that has kept it relevant to this day. Constructed through an unstable period for Liverpool, marked by 2 world wars and the Liverpool Blitz, the cathedral stands as a powerful symbol of Liverpool's resilience and unity, capturing the city's enduring spirit. Scott envisioned the cathedral as a welcoming space for people of all faiths and backgrounds, fostering community and inclusivity. Programs like art exhibitions and interfaith dialogue promote harmony within Liverpool's diverse community. The cathedral welcomes approximately around 600,000 visitors annually, with around 37,000 attending services regularly. Additionally, around 14,500 students participate in educational programs each year. Many more are engaged through volunteering, choir activities, and various community initiatives. Liverpool Cathedral remains a vibrant Christian church, grounded in daily worship, including morning prayers, midday Eucharist, and choral evensong. Beyond worship, music and education programs engage young families and local schools throughout the year. It's a thriving also commercial arm, including a shop and bistro supports secular events such as gala dinners, graduation, charity fundraisers, and cultural installations. These religious and secular events alike truly reflect Scott's vision of majesty blended with modernity. A current project running from, I think, 2023 to 2026 explores Liverpool's cathedral social impact on both visitors and non-visitors, aiming to foster a sustainable, research-informed and engaged community. With 30,000 visitors in just 1 week, The Light Before Christmas in 2023 creatively shared the Christmas story with audiences across the city and beyond. I think from around 7,000 responses collected through the ticket quarter. I have the figures here. Yeah, the lights before the Christmas show. It was found that visitors were primarily motivated to spend time with family and friends, learn something new, enjoy the unique atmosphere, reflect personally. Main activities included exploring the cathedral, lighting candles, saying prayers, and more. The cathedral's social impact is furthered by partnerships with different charities and creating its own charity, Mika Liverpool, and by hosting meaningful events from graduations to funerals. It's truly a safe and welcoming space, supporting the communities in times of both joy and sorrow. The cathedral serves as a profound site of memory, where Liverpool's history and personal story intertwine. More than a historical landmark, it's a vessel for intangible cultural heritage, holding the rituals, traditions, and shared memories that shape both individual and collective identity. So, what elements of the cathedral's social and cultural significance could be considered part of its living heritage? Is it the traditional music and choir, the Christmas and Easter rituals, or the simple act of lighting a candle? What deepens our understanding of why this place is cherished by the community? Could it be the enduring bell ringing traditions? So I will leave you with these questions. When a national inventory of intangible cultural heritage is established in the UK, what aspects of the cathedral would you consider essential to include? Which key elements should we as a community put forward to highlight and sustain the cathedral's value and role within Liverpool? Thank you.
Thank you, Ataa. That's great. So thank you to all three of our speakers for a very varied and kind of broad picture of the history, the social aspects, and the physical constructional issues that we're confronted with this incredible structure in our city. Whilst you've been talking, we've had a series of questions put into the chat, and sorry, apologies about the fireworks in the background. And I will try and build some of those into our into the Q&A now. But before I go over to those, I had a few questions myself for our speakers. So going back to Joseph, you mentioned really that you thought that it's not really a Gothic cathedral. Would that be an accurate way to surmise what you were saying?
No, I'm not sure I put it quite like that, but it has a plan which is very un-Gothic. It's often been remarked that it's much more akin to a classical building in plan, like St. Paul's Cathedral, for instance. The symmetry about both axes is not something you would find in any medieval church, but you would find it, or something approaching that, in a number of classical buildings. But it's a hybrid, I think. You know, it uses elements of Gothic architecture, but interprets them in new and interesting and creative ways. You would never mistake it for a medieval building, but you would see its the legacy of medieval architecture in it.
Right, thanks, Joseph. I mean, that legacy of medieval architecture, obviously, one of the aspects of that is building in load-bearing masonry. And Mike, just thinking about some of the issues that you have about, what's it like maintaining a massive lump of brick and stone?
Well, obviously, we have the challenge of of access that I talked about. But I think we've got to remember as well that Liverpool Cathedral, whilst it is a big lump of brick and stone, it is quite new. It's not an old building. So unlike most of the cathedrals in the country that are 400 plus years old, and prior to that as well, Liverpool is, bits of it are quite recent. So it's still sort of bedding down a bit. It's still sort of settling. So a lot of what we see in other cathedrals has been repaired 500 years ago, and we're just seeing that sort of bedding in now. So we just need to temper where you might, the alarmist reaction is, oh, we've got to go and fix that bit. We try to understand from a sort of fact-based approach of structural monitoring exactly where we need to go and focus our efforts to fix things, and some things aren't quite as bad as they actually seem. If you were to go onto one of the either of the transepts, either of the 4 transepts, and look at the gallery balustrades, you would see some hugely alarming cracks. But we know that they're not moving at all, so that they can just be sort of left. But yeah, it is a challenge.
Great. Well, you actually just answered one of the audience questions there, which was about state of subsidence in the South Transept. So that was a question from Anne Collinson. So I think you've answered that one, hopefully. Great. Ataa, the kind of the physical aspects of the building are kind of obvious. Yeah, we can see the scale of this as a Grade 1 listed monument. The social aspects are, I think, coming back to your final question to the audience and throwing it back to you, if you don't mind, is with the designation of intangible, with the UK adopting the kind of designation of protection for intangible heritage characteristics, and it is a very wide range of things. For example, I think Uzbekistan, the art of wit is a protected item in Uzbekistan, which is quite entertaining in itself. But what aspects do you think, intangible aspects of the cathedral, do you think would be suitable for putting forward?
I think there is a lot if we can think of. I think mainly the main celebrations like Christmas services, Easter celebrations, community gathering. These events maintain a link to the building's religious history and to the community, because they reinforce its role in the local collective memory. Additionally, the variety of engagement and education programs to educate the communities as well as the visitors about the religious practices, the historical significance, and the stories associated with the cathedral. They are all of them are really part of that. The other thing is the music and the choir. They are really, really important. Bell ringing as well. It's an important tradition. So we can really put a long list of important intangible aspects of the cathedral or traditions. The other thing is some of the features, the architectural features, could be linked to many aspects of intangible cultural heritage. Story collection, oral history, for example, the memories, the different, even funerals, held in the cathedral. All of these are very, very important.
Thanks, Ataa. So it's a collection of. It's the fact that the cathedral represents so many things, I suppose, is its strength, that rather than one particular focus.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So just coming back, we've had a couple of very technical questions for you, Mike. One here. Let me just find it. Technical issues. You could probably do with a great, someone said here, this is, sorry, from Dan Barber, from our president of the Liverpool Architectural Society. You could probably do a great talk on the use of digital twins in architecture and conservation. The technical question here, and this is a very technical one, is what's the file size of this, and how on earth do you find a computer to navigate this?
That's a good question. Yeah, and I've got a really good answer. So we've got two formats on that we're looking for that we have the cathedral model on. I can show you one of them because it's here. So the cathedral model that you saw is on that hard drive, which I sit sort of remotely. I don't know the exact size, but that's about what a 60 gig hard drive, and it fits comfortably on that. The better model version that we have is the cloud-based platform. So it sits on at the moment, the surveyors, the company that did it, they sit it on their server. We pay a rental fee to them, very low cost rental fee, about 50 quid a year. And it sits on a cloud platform, which if you have the link to it, you can click on and you can look at it on your phone over a 4G network. Slightly lower resolution, but a very, very, very good tool to communicate. So very simple things like I'd be chatting to the clerk of works and he'll be stood on a roof somewhere and I could be in, I don't know, on another church on the other end of the country, and he's got a problem with the gutter. He goes onto it, takes a screen grab, sends it to me, etc., etc., and we can communicate really quickly that way. So actually quite low file size, surprisingly.
Thanks. Very technical question there for the architects in the room tonight. And actually picking up on a point that a technical one in a way, but this is perhaps for all three of you. Again, a question from Dan Barber about the threats to the cathedral. I think, Joseph, you talked about it in your final slide about the threats to the cathedral from long views, about it losing its impact on the skyline of Liverpool. The question is, do you think the cathedral should set up protected views like there are of St. Paul's Cathedral? Now, obviously, it's not entirely in the remit of the cathedral to do this, but it's certainly, if the cathedral was to instigate it, do you think that that would be something worth considering? And I think that's a question for all three of you, really.
Go on.
Sorry,
Mark.
you go, Joseph. You go.
No, I was just thinking of recent developments on the waterfront, and we tend to think of their impact on the pierhead buildings, but actually their impact on the cathedral, as seen from the river, are considerable. And there have been some developments which pay heed to the cathedral, the conference centre, for instance, by keeping low. So yes, I think we should be considering those long views, and we should be trying to identify ways to protect them.
Yeah, I'd agree with that as well. If anybody were to go on the cathedral website, they would see the excellent conservation management plan that Alan Baxter put together, and that identifies key views, and a lot of them are from the waterfront up to the cathedral. And I haven't done the exercise, but it would be interesting to do it since 2017 to see how many of those key views have actually been interrupted by development that's taken place. And I think again, Joseph's presentation made a point of the cathedral sits on the highest bit of ground in Liverpool. St James's Mount is the highest and oldest, I think, public realm again in the city. And the great and the good used to parade along there and look down to the waterfront and look at their fleet, and that, rightly or wrongly, but that connectivity between the site and the waterfront, it potentially is being diminished, which is a shame.
Yeah, definitely agree with that, because if we are, in terms of heritage and cultural heritage, if we are defining identity, there is the physical identity and the intangible identity or visual identity. So definitely these developments are impacting on the visual identity in terms of the cathedral and its surrounding.
Great, thank you. There's another, I mean, one question that we'd certainly brought up in our discussions before this evening was thinking forward then for the cathedral going forward, not just in terms of protection, but in a more active way. I mean, obviously, Ataa, you've talked about that in a social sense, but I'm just thinking, Mike, in terms of physically, not maintenance, but also, but more about the potential for the cathedral to address things like zero carbon ambitions.
Yeah, it is something the cathedral are actively considering and are trying to move forward with. Obviously, we've got the Church of England's net zero drive for 2030. Quite how achievable that will be. We do need to consider, but I was in a meeting week before last with church commissioners and others, and we were talking about the cathedral and its carbon use, and in fact, if you look across the Church of England, cathedral buildings themselves are, I think the figure was 2% of the carbon generator for the Church of England. So that puts the context of all 42 of the C of E cathedrals, 2% of the C of E's carbon footprint. And all of those buildings are hugely significant heritage assets. But at Liverpool, the team there and myself with my involvement since 2019 have been looking at ways that we can reduce carbon. We've looked at and we've looked quite detailed at a solar panel array. We are considering the air source heat pump for the well. The issues that we have, and again with the solar panel array, is we've approached it with a very fact-based assessment, and we're balancing off the benefit against the heritage impacts, all the things we've just talked about views, diminishing the view with a large array on the chancel roof, for instance. We've looked at the copper covering on which that array would sit, and then when you put all those things into the mix and you churn out the figures at the end, they're just huge numbers, and the project like that just wasn't washing its face. Unfortunately, it was just too expensive, so we moved away from that, and we're now looking at more concentrated things like the Westwell air source heat pump, with a view to citywide district heating network, hopefully coming online, with conversations about that happening in 2030 or further forward. So the cathedral have developed this sort of this long-term move towards reducing carbon, and again, all difficult challenges, but Liverpool are facing them.
Great, thanks, Mike. We've got a series of audience questions on historical stuff that I'll bunch these together for you, Joseph. There's three here. One was from Roshin Stodden, saying, to what extent do you think Scott was influenced by Bodley on the Lady Chapel? The second one was why, from Paul Cross, why did Scott change his plan so radically in 1910? And the final one, and I can't remember who it was from, was did he ever consider a spire?
Well, to take the last one first, no, I'm not aware that he ever considered a spire, although, I mean, you'll have noticed in that perspective of the 1910 redesign that I showed, that earliest version of the central tower did have a sort of pyramid roof on top of it, maybe slightly more than a pyramid roof, but not really lofty enough to count as a spire. So no, I mean, several of the other competition designs in both competitions, the 1884 and the 1901, incorporated spires, but not Scott's designs. And he seems to have had this strong preference for squared off shapes, I think, squared off towers, and that horizontal element that I mentioned earlier. Why the radical plan change of 1910? Well, the short answer is there isn't any documentary evidence explaining that. So you have to infer from the plan itself and what was gained thereby. And the key gain was that externally, that central emphasis with the central tower, which he seems to have attached great importance to. But also internally, from a functional point of view, the creation of that great central space. I mean, it's often been said that the central space is, the same size as St. George's Hall. I don't know if that actually works in exact measurements, but you get the idea. And that wasn't provided for in Scott's original plan. It was something that was requested under the terms of the competition. And so retrospectively, he was providing what the diocese wanted. The reason behind that is that whereas medieval churches were designed around processions and the separation of clergy and the faithful, it was recognised that an early 20th century cathedral needed to do something different. It was an assembly of people, and it was designed for Protestant worship with the focus on the preacher, and that could be accommodated in a building with a large uninterrupted central space. And so that's what the Cathedral Committee wanted, and that's what Scott provided in 1910, if not in 1901. The third question was about bodily influence. And again, there's a dearth of documentary evidence about this, and it's generally been assumed, and I assumed it myself when I wrote the Personal Architectural Guide description of the cathedral, that the Lady Chapel shows Bodley's influence in that emphasis on ornament and decoration and detail, and that once Bodley was out of the way, Scott adopted a more simplified kind of Gothic. However, in that recent study of Bodley by Michael Hall, he quotes from various letters between Bodley and Scott to suggest that the picture is more complicated than that, and that probably most of what we see in the Lady Chapel was down to Scott and not Bodley. And Bodley tried to alter things, he tried to modify details. Both architects had to sign off the drawings before they were accepted by the Cathedral Committee. But the driving force always seems to have been Scott, and Bodley adjusted details, but the overall concept seems to have been Scott's.
Great, thanks, Joseph. We've got a question here from Millie Hayden for Mike. About when you're undertaking these works, to what extent are you sort of having to work around cultural activities? And the example that was given was charity abseiling. But also, I know you mentioned in your presentation is it the Sparrowhawks as well, who are obviously not that keen on the drone?
The Peregrines.
Peregrines, sorry.
Yeah, which are back. Yeah, I mean, all of the work that happens at the cathedral to date, certainly during my tenure, the cathedral's active, working. We've never interrupted a service. I don't think, Philip, he may shake his head. No, I don't think we have. So no, we work around everything. I think and the success of that, and this is something that I alluded to in my short presentation, was communication between what could otherwise be disparate teams at the cathedral. It's a big entity, it's a big engine, and we're very good now at cross communication. Everybody knows what everybody's working on, and we're willing to collaborate and work together. The charity abseil, no, doesn't get in the way. Quite happy with that carrying on. I think somebody has flown a hot air balloon before in the great space before my time, but that probably didn't disturb anything. Hope that answers that question.
Great, thanks. Quite a few of your answers, the sort of central space comes up, and this is perhaps one more for Ataa. Obviously, the cathedral was designed as a cathedral, as a religious space for a far more religious society, based around kind of planning that was suitable for liturgy. Yet there's a great deal about the cathedral that makes no liturgical sense. There's enormous volumes that have no obvious religious purpose in there. To what extent do you think this is, in a way, do you think Scott is planning ahead here, thinking about the space, the central space, as Joseph said, as a more generic assembly space, as developing a secular characteristic for a civic society rather than a liturgical characteristic for a more religious one?
Yeah, I think the flexibility of the space is really an important feature, and it gives the cathedral its value within the community and its vital role in bringing different community groups from different ethnic backgrounds together. Because we can see that, in terms of Liverpool as a city is like a mosaic, full of different people coming from different backgrounds, and that they belong to Liverpool. Liverpool for them is home now. So I think the cathedral emphasizes that. And it brings all this community together because it's flexible space. I don't know what Scott was thinking when he designed the cathedral, but I think that particular, I think it was very clever, because even his thoughts of like Gothic and modernity, we can see them very clearly in the cathedral. And whether the cathedral, will continue to play both role as a religious space as well as a secular one, I think this is really significant, and it's part of its values.
Right. It's definitely a building where form does not follow function. Form is, and then functions finds the space within it. I think it's true. We've had an interesting one here from Roisin Stolen saying, found it difficult to find a decent biography on Gilbert Scott. Any recommendations? Now, actually, I might be able to answer this one for you, as I raised exactly the same point with the 20th Century Society a few years ago with sadly departed Elaine Harwood. And she said she had been in discussion with the Scott family and who hold the archive about a biography. There is a small book written by one of the family based on a lecture, but not a great deal else, I think, in terms of recent writing about it. Unfortunately, they couldn't find a suitable format because the work, the oeuvre, if you like, of Scott is so vast, not just his buildings, but the range of things he did, that none of the existing publications that the 20th Century Society were engaged in would fit the bill. And I think they are, so I think the kind of opportunity is still out there. Any historians who are keen to spend a long time writing a biography. Joseph, this might be your area of expertise.
Yeah, no, well, it was just a couple of suggestions, which the question has probably looked at already. But Gavin Stamp, the late Gavin Stamp, was a great enthusiast for Scott's architecture, and he wrote the quite substantial entry for Scott in the Dictionary of National Biography. So if you've not seen that, that is well worth looking up. And it has further bibliography and sources listed. And also by Gavin Stamp is the volume of the catalogue of the drawings collection of the RIBA, which covers the whole of the Scott family because they were a dynasty, of course. Giles Gilbert was only one of them. But there is obviously a section about Giles Gilbert Scott's drawings in that catalogue, and it's a very useful overview of his career, most of which I think is represented in the drawings collection. That's slightly more difficult to get hold of, but the Dictionary of National Biography is available online. So
great, thanks, Joseph. So I think we've kind of gone through most of the. I'll just check if we've missed any of the questions from the audience here. I'm just running through. Oh, here's a quick one. A quick one for Mike. Which side of the cathedral is most affected by weather conditions? Is it the south side?
Yes.
That's an easy one. Just looking through, I think that's... oh, here's an interesting one from Andrew Hunt, who sings in one of the choirs in the cathedral. And he says, obviously, the cathedral has outstanding acoustics with an incredibly long reverberation time. Was this planned in? Was it a kind of conscious thing, or is it actually a lucky accident?
I suspect that it's a happy accident, but am I right in thinking that stone vaulted buildings are always reverberative, and that's why, choirs sing polyphony in, Oxbridge chapels with stone vaults, because you get that wonderful reverberation.
Yes, yes. I think it's the space does generate the music to a certain extent. And Canon Anderson, you have an answer to this, perhaps?
Not necessarily an answer. It's I'm not sure I would agree with Andrew that it's a wonderful acoustic. It's quite a challenging acoustic. So it's the Lady Chapel has a much cleaner, a more typical kind of acoustic. The main space, the echo is actually so long that in terms of it being a kind of unified liturgical space from one end of the building to the other, that's a challenge for designers of contemporary sound systems to try and work out how to make sure that people across the space are all hearing the spoken word at the same time. To kind of go back to the original brief of the competition in 1904, but I think what I would say is that Scott worked for certainly the kind of second half of his time in the role as architect, hand in glove with the first dean, Dwelly, who was quite a remarkable character in his own right, and the two of them seem to have had this very fruitful partnership of how to inhabit this unfolding space with worship and music. Mike talked about how we just recently finished the cathedral organ to its original specifications. And that's partly about having different pieces of the instrument making sounds in different parts of the building. So Scott was working with some of these key partners, like the first organists as well, in working out how to animate this space. But yeah, the acoustic is a joy, but also a challenge.
Right, yes. Long reverberation times. But Joseph, you're right. Long.
Yeah, it was just a little add-on to that. In Charles Riley's autobiography, he describes the funeral service of one of the city fathers. I can't remember who it was now, but he describes very vividly the impression made on him by the choir singing in the choir stalls and a single voice singing over them for within the tower space. So you had this as a background, you had the singing of the choir, but you had this single voice chanting high above. And that would have been, I think, in the 1930s or thereabouts. So yes, it's an example of experimenting with the acoustic of the building and the sound possibilities of the space.
And I think that's an interesting point about the what Scott has perhaps bequeathed us with this amazing structure is something that we're still learning how to use. It is not a simple liturgical space. It is not a simple musical space. It's not a simple social space. It's a highly complicated, very subtle building, despite its obvious presence, that I think both in all these different ways, we are still trying to work out how to use it. And perhaps we always will. That's perhaps the whole point, is that it's always a comma, the use of the building. So there is a point here that Katie has made, actually, which is one of the organisers for tonight, Katie Dyer from the Cathedral. And she said that David Lewis, who is one of the panellists in Friday's talk about Scott, in the second half of this celebration, is currently writing, and has been for the last 10 years, I'll put that bit in there, a biography of Scott. So he's a big topic with big buildings that needs a big book. So, that's gone through all the questions that we've had, I think, now from the audience. And I think most of the ones that I had for our speakers as well. I think just as a final point to each of you individually, start in the order probably that you spoke is the easiest way to do it. What is your favourite part of the cathedral?
Can I have two favourite parts? One, a big one. So the area under the tower, I think, because it's just like nothing else in architecture, the sheer scale and extraordinary height of it. And then a very small thing, which is the elaborately wrought handle and hinges of that door from the Lady Chapel into the vestries, which is a marvellous piece of arts and crafts metalwork. So I love looking at that.
Thanks, Joseph. Mike, your favourite part?
Yeah, I'm going to have two as well, if Joseph is having two. they're both quite big ones, because if you put me on a roof, that's where I'm happiest. So there's a photograph of me on the start of the presentation where I'm sat on the choir roof, and then you've got the view to Compass South, Liturgical East, and it's lovely. So it places that you can that you don't often get to, but I'm privileged to be able to go to them because I have the key. So to go and stand on a roof and look back at the tower, just that different angle, and some of the different the nuances of the details that you're most familiar with, and the second one would be, from a specific approach, you have to go up the lift, go over the crossing inside the roof space, and then ascend the staircase of the tower, not the lift. Go up the staircase of the tower. You'd need me and a key, but if you were to do that, you'd then come out into the belfry, and wow, that is wow, because you have that massive juxtaposition then between medieval exterior or simple Gothic, and then you've got this almost brutalist concrete interior going on, and it just blows your mind. So yeah, those two.
And Ataa, your favourite part, or two? You're allowed to. Everyone else has to.
Yes, I'm going to have to as well. So the Lady Chapel, because it's the smallest, and I don't know, I can feel like personal reflection sometimes in it. And I think it was the first part to be completed, right? And it has like very, very beautiful stained glass. And this is my second favorite part, the stained glass windows, because, you know, they illustrate various biblical themes and saints and historical events, and they really contribute to the beautiful and fantastic atmosphere.
Thank you. And now I'm going to throw a wild one in here. Canon Philip Anderson, as you have joined our panel and you use the building more than anyone else, do you have a favourite part of the building?
I do. So I use the Lady Chapel a lot, and it's beautiful. But in a sense, I think actually the most sublime, and perhaps the most Scott bit, is the view from the well up to the high altar. And there's something about the acoustic, which means that sometimes the sound from the choir right up at the top end by the high altar goes up into the space under the tower and then comes back down again to the West End. We had a big service celebrating the centenary of the consecration in July, and I could hear with crystal clarity a girl in the cathedral choir singing a solo as I was standing at the back of the great procession that was going to be walking. We do a lot of walking up and down the building on these occasions. And something just about the intimacy and the majesty of that space. So yeah, being there at the threshold at the West End, which is often the place where people have that moment of wow and awe as they walk through the doors, I think is probably my favourite spot.
Thank you. Well, I suppose I get to have two favourite spots as well, don't I? Mine is actually the reverse view of yours, Canon Philip Anderson. I like the view from the ambulatory behind the high altar, up the steps through the framed arch, down the length of the cathedral. It feels, it encaptures, I suppose, what Joseph was talking about, in that Scott wanted to inspire awe, and it really does. And it's got the layering of the distance is vast. And the other one isn't even a view in the cathedral; it's a view of the cathedral, and it's a view from Canning Street as you approach Canning Street in the city, and those fine Georgian terraces crank round. And behind them is this totally improbable tower, vast, alien to their Georgian context, but brilliant at the same time. And it's that juxtaposition of this vast memorial that Scott has given us, this great potential sort of space for all sorts of social, physical, creative activities that we should be, I think, eternally grateful for in this city. We didn't do bad. I think the cathedral authorities did very well in their selection of architects. So I think we're kind of, there have been no further questions, and so we're probably coming towards an end. So I would actually just like to thank, I'd like to thank Canon Anderson for hosting us tonight, as it were, in a virtual sense. I would like to thank our three speakers. I'd like to thank Joseph Sharples, Mike Darwell, and Ataa Alsalloum. And thank you for your insight, your time, and your kind of energy and enthusiasm. And also, I think a word of thanks should go to Elisa, Emma, and Katie, and the team at the Cathedral who have organised this event, and point out that there is a second event on Friday this week. So please make sure you attend that, sign up for that. Again, it's an online free event. And thank you, everyone, for coming along. I hope you've had an enjoyable evening.
Okay, thank you.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Good night.
Bye. Good night.